In the small town of Millbrook, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, the cemetery was a place of solace and quiet contemplation. On one chilly autumn morning, a peculiar sight drew the attention of the townspeople. A majestic chestnut horse stood vigil at a freshly marked grave. Horse, known as Spirit, had been the faithful companion of an elderly man named Mr. Harold Whitman, who had passed away just days before. Spirit's presence at the cemetery was not unusual in itself. He had often accompanied Mr. Harold on his walks, even in the later years when the old man's steps grew heavy and his breath shallow. But today, the horse stood alone, his head bowed, his eyes fixed on the small mound of earth that now marked his owner's final resting place. The townspeople had seen this before, the brief visits of pets mourning their owners, but Spirit's unwavering dedication was something else entirely. Sarah, the owner of the local animal sanctuary, had known Mr. Harold and Spirit for years. She often helped Mr. Harold with the horse's care, and the bond between the two had always been a source of wonder and joy. When she heard about Mr. Harold's passing, she immediately thought of Spirit, had promised to take him in, but as she approached the cemetery, she found the horse already there, as if he had known. Sarah stood a few paces away, watching Spirit. She remembered the first time she had met the pair. Mr. Harold, a retired veterinarian, had found Spirit abandoned and injured, a foal barely able to stand. With his gentle hands and unwavering patience, he had nursed the horse back to health. Over the years, their bond had deepened, and Spirit had become more than just a pet. He was a friend, a confidant, and a source of comfort. Mr. Harold's house, a quaint cottage on the outskirts of town, had always been a haven for animals. The old man had a heart as vast as the fields he had once tended. Spirit, with his fiery chestnut coat and expressive eyes, was a constant presence in the cottage. In the summer, they would ride together through the woods, with Mr. Harold's laughter mingling with the sounds of nature. In the winter, they would sit by the fireplace, the horse's warm breath a soothing presence in the cold air. Sarah approached Spirit, her heart heavy. She had prepared for this moment, but it still felt wrong to lead the horse away from his beloved owner. "Come on, Spirit," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "It's time to come home." But Spirit did not move. He stood as if rooted to the spot, his gaze never leaving the grave. Sarah knelt beside him, stroking his mane. "Mr. Harold wouldn't want you to stay here, Spirit. He'd want you to be happy and well cared for." The horse's eyes, usually so full of life, now held a deep sorrow. Sarah decided to leave him for a while, hoping he would follow her when he was ready. She returned to the sanctuary, her mind racing with thoughts of how to help the grieving animal. Word of Spirit's behavior spread quickly through the town. People began to visit the cemetery, drawn by the horse's devotion. Some brought apples and carrots. Others simply came to stand with him, offering a silent show of support. Mrs. Elizabeth, a widow who lived near the cemetery, started visiting Spirit every day. She had lost her husband a year ago and understood the depth of his grief. Elizabeth would sit beside Spirit, speaking softly to him about Mr. Harold and the good times they had shared. The horse would nuzzle her hand, and she would stroke his neck, feeling a connection that transcended words. "You're not alone, Spirit," she would say. "We're all here for you." As the weeks went by, Spirit's visits to the cemetery became a daily ritual. He would arrive at dawn and leave at dusk, and in between he would stand by the grave, as if guarding it from the world. Town had grown used to his presence, and many began to see it as a sign of something greater, testament to the enduring love between a man and his horse. One afternoon, as Elizabeth was sitting with Spirit, a young girl named Lily approached. She had just moved to Millbrook with her grandmother, who was struggling with loneliness and the recent loss of her husband. Lily was fascinated by the horse and the story of his devotion. She reached out tentatively, and Spirit, sensing her sincerity, allowed her to pet him. Lily's grandmother, Mrs. Clara, joined them, her eyes brimming with tears. "He's so beautiful," she said, her voice hoarse with emotion. "And so brave." Elizabeth nodded. "Mr. Harold once told me that Spirit was his greatest friend. I think he's here, because he can't bear to say goodbye." Mrs. Clara smiled, a bittersweet expression. "I think he's teaching us something too, about loyalty and love." Inspired by Spirit's dedication, Sarah decided to do more. She organized a community event at the sanctuary, inviting everyone to share stories of their pets and the bonds they had formed. Response was overwhelming. People brought pictures, letters, and mementos, creating a small exhibit that celebrated the love between humans and animals. Spirit, now a symbol of loyalty and grief, became a focal point of the sanctuary. His visits to the cemetery continued, but he also spent time at the sanctuary, where he found a new family. Children adored him, and the elderly found comfort in his presence. Mrs. Clara and her granddaughter often visited, and Spirit seemed to enjoy their company, his sorrow easing with each visit. As the months passed, Spirit's daily visits to the cemetery became a source of healing for the entire town. People found themselves talking more openly about their losses and the ways they coped. The cemetery, once a place of sorrow, now held a sense of hope. The horse's presence reminded everyone that even in the darkest times, there was still love and connection to be found. Mrs. Elizabeth and Mrs. Clara grew closer, their shared experiences bonding them in a way they had never expected. Lily, with her grandmother's encouragement, started writing stories about Spirit, and Mr. Harold capturing their bond in words that resonated with many. One crisp spring morning, Sarah arrived at the cemetery to find Spirit lying down beside Mr. Harold's grave. His eyes were closed, and his breathing was shallow. She rushed to his side, her heart pounding with fear. "Spirit, it's Sarah. Can you hear me?" The horse's eyes fluttered open, and he nuzzled her hand weakly. Sarah felt a surge of emotion, knowing that this might be their last moment together. "It's okay, Spirit. You've been a good friend." Mr. Harold would be so proud. As the sun rose higher, the community gathered around the horse. Lily and her grandmother, Mrs. Elizabeth, and many others who had been touched by Spirit's story. They sang softly, a hymn of love and farewell. Spirit's eyes closed once more, and this time, he did not open them. The town of Millbrook mourned the loss of Spirit, but they also celebrated the life he had lived, the love he had shared. Sarah, with the help of the community, decided to create a memorial garden at the sanctuary, where Spirit and Mr. Harold's bond would be remembered. The garden featured a statue of the horse and his owner, a bronze casting that captured their loving connection. Lily's stories were compiled into a small book, which was distributed to the town's schools and libraries. The horse and the old man's story became a part of Millbrook's heritage, a reminder of the power of love and the beauty of devotion. In the years that followed, the sanctuary flourished. It became a place where people could find solace and healing, not just for their animals, but for themselves. Mrs. Elizabeth and Mrs. Clara continued to visit, their friendship a testament to the town's ability to come together in times of need. The cemetery, too, changed. It became a place of reflection and community, where people would often meet and share stories. A small plaque was placed near Mr. Harold's grave, reading, "Here lies Mr. Harold Whitman and his faithful friend Spirit, whose love transcended life and death." In the quiet moments, when the sun set over the hills and the wind whispered through the trees, it was easy to imagine that Mr. Harold and Spirit were still there, riding through the fields, their bond unbroken by time. The legacy of Spirit and Mr. Harold lived on in the hearts of the people of Millbrook. Their story taught generations about the depth of love and the strength of loyalty. The sanctuary, now a place of healing and connection, stood as a testament to the enduring bond between humans and animals. And in the evenings, when the sky turned a deep shade of blue, the townspeople would often see a chestnut horse standing by a grave, his head bowed in silent tribute. They knew it was Spirit, watching over Mr. Harold, and they felt a sense of peace, knowing that some bonds are eternal, even in the face of loss. The end.